Okay. Dr. Tyagarajan, we are live. Tyagarajan? Hello?
Yes, sir, we are live now.
Tyagarajan?
Sir, we are live now.
Okay. Hello?
We are live now.
Yeah. Who is that?
Yes, sir, we are live now. Tyagarajan?
Okay. So, very good afternoon to all of you. Can you mute your other speakers?
Yes, sir, did that.
Very good afternoon to you. I am Dr. Arumugam. I'm the President of Indian Association of Sports Medicine. Along with me, Dr. Tyagarajan is web coordinator for this meeting. And after a very successful first webinar yesterday, we are here on new, very interesting topics for today. So without taking much of your time, I take privilege to introduce Professor Louise Burke, who has 30 years of experience as a sports dietitian, including last 20 years as the head of sports Department of Sports Nutrition at the very prestigious, famous Australian Institute of Sport. She has completed PhD studies in sports nutrition and continues to undertake research in this area. So, Professor Burke, on behalf of the IASM, I take this opportunity to welcome you and thank you at the outset for taking your time off and be with us. Please go on with your lecture.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. I'm working with some resources that are a little bit wobbly, but I hope we get a good lecture out of it. So last year I was invited to a conference to speak on this topic of why we should do more research on female athletes. And when I was given the topic, I was quite bemused about why someone would need to speak on that. And I was game and I thought, I'll look into the matter. And so what I'm going to do today is give you a 15-minute speed date on some of the things that I found when I looked into the topic. So the first thing was, once I started looking into the literature, there is a lot of information or a lot of other people that are worried that women are underrepresented in research in general, but particularly in sports science. And when I looked into the kinds of ways in which this works, this is a study that I found where researchers have looked through all the literature that's been published over a particular time in the sports medicine journals that we read, and it found that only 35% of the representative participants in these studies were females. And if we drill down more quickly and look into the sports science, breaking it up into the types of research that we do, here's another survey which has looked at all the publications over 5 months in some of the journals that we read. And you can see that in the various areas of sports science research, the kinds of research investigations we do around performance are the ones in which women are underrepresented the most. Only 3% of the studies that were reported in these journals had female participants in these investigations around research for performance. And I thought to myself, well, that's not unusual if you look at any other aspect of life, whether it's politics or company boards or whatever it is, women tend to be underrepresented in terms of the top positions. And so why would sport be any different? But when I started to think about, in particular, my area of work in Australia, I began to see how unfair this was. Because if you have a look at our success in the Olympic Games over the last 100 years, and remembering that it's only recently that there were equal numbers of medals available for males and females, you can see from these stats that I was able to pull out that it's females that have been most successful in terms of Australia's success at the Olympic Games. And so it seems to me most unfair that the people that do the best job get the least resources attributed to them. And so I started to become more interested in what we could do if we're trying to be more successful in trying to shunt some of the resources towards the people that are more likely to do well with them. So as I said, only 3% of the studies that are done on performance research have female subjects. So most of the studies are done with males, and we just assume that we can take the same results and say men and women are going to respond equally. But in just about every other aspect of life you can think about, we know that men and women are different. And here's one of the ways that really annoys my husband in terms of the ways that males and females are different. But if we're looking at it a bit more seriously and think about the ways in which males and females may respond differently to performance nutrition strategies, well, there's some very obvious ones. Firstly, there's differences in body size and mass and the amount of lean mass, the size of organs which might be responding to different nutrients. Males and females have very different hormonal environments, and females have that extra complication that the hormonal environment changes over the course of the menstrual cycle. So, and then also may be different in terms of females that have amenorrhea or use the oral contraceptive pill. So it's a changing landscape when you're dealing with females. There are differences in their nutrient intakes, their nutrition requirements, and then there are a whole lot of other factors that we simply do not know. And the only way that we can see if males and females do respond differently to any nutrition intervention is actually to try it. And some of these areas around changes in the hormonal influences and changes in female hormones are now becoming quite useful in different ways of training women, different ways of training them over the hormonal cycle. And there are some experts in the world, and there are some teams now that take up the information that we have and have very different programs for females that change over the course of their cycle. But I'm just going to give you some examples of some of these things that we just simply don't know about now, because even though we can predict some things from knowing about female hormones, there are probably other areas in which females are quite different to males, and the only way we can find that out is by doing the study. And so if we give just a couple of examples, here's one that's of interest to me in sports nutrition. One of the interesting stories over the last decade in sports nutrition has been the knowledge that when you feed nitrate, often in the form of beetroot juice, to athletes, the oral bacteria in their mouths break down that nitrate and what we can think about is, would there be a reason for males and females to have any different responses to that nitrate intervention? If we look at some research, not in a performance angle, but just in the ways that males and females do differ, it seems that females have higher nitrite levels in the blood, which means that they're converting more of the nitrate in their diet into the nitrite, which becomes the useful compound from which we produce the nitric oxide. And we don't know why. You can have a look at the amount of the microbes in the mouth that break down the nitrate to nitrite. You can look at the different kinds of enzymes that would predict this. And it's no real reason can underline why we see this difference, but it would suggest that female athletes might respond better or get a better performance outcome by using the beetroot juice protocols that we now know about. But we need to look more closely to see if that's in fact an outcome. Another area in which we've been looking at performance supplements is the caffeine story. And we already know that we have to scale the doses for males and females differently because of body size differences. And so now we give females and males grams or milligrams of caffeine per kilogram body mass. But we wanted to know if there was a difference in the way they might respond to caffeine. And so we did a study back in 2012 looking at the Olympic course for London in road cycling, and had males and females taking caffeine and beetroot juice, gave them the same dose, and we're able to see that both groups had that same response of improving their performance by about 1.5% in terms of time, or 3 to 4% in terms of power. And so we were able to be quite confident that we could give males and females the same protocols for that particular nutrition intervention, but it was only because we did the experiment that we could have that confidence. And it's not just, does the nutrition intervention have a different response in males and females that we need to think about? We also need to think about, when we have information, knowledge, how do males and females respond to taking knowledge and putting it into practice? And I know as a practitioner that males and females think quite differently about food and the way they respond to advice. And so even though I might have a certain nutrition strategy that I know about, I might have to give the application of that in practical terms quite differently. For example, I can say to a male, in terms of post-exercise recovery, that's good to have a certain amount of protein, and I can put that in a chocolate shake and give it to a male, and he'd be quite happy to have it. As far as he's concerned, it's just nutrition. He doesn't care what it tastes like or how much it costs. But a female will have quite a different way in which they would like to consume their protein. They might want it to taste nicer. They might want it to be something that they can enjoy in a social setting. And so when we have information, we have to make sure that we give the practical implementation of it in the right way that people want to hear. And there are quite a few studies, and here's just one example of it, where males and females might have the same amount of information about how they should change their carbohydrate or their energy intake from day to day in terms of periodizing nutrition. And we find that males do that, but females don't. Females are less likely to want to increase their calorie intake or their carbohydrate intake on the days that they train harder because they have a fear about it. So we need to think more about just the knowledge, but how it can be turned into practice. So now that I've convinced myself that I need to look at female sports nutrition separately and differently, I thought I'd give myself a bit of a test to see how well I'm doing. And I went through all the publications and all the studies that I've done over my 30 years, and I found that I had 68 different publications which involved an intervention study around a nutrition strategy for performance, and I had 68 different opportunities to include females in those publications. And when I counted up how well I did, in terms of how many times did I have females in the study at all, how many times did I do a study that actually compared males and females, or how many times did I just look at females exclusively, this was my tally. And if you have a look at that in terms of percentages, I'm doing very poorly. I'm one of the people that's contributing to the problem of females being under-researched than being one of the promoters of the success of female athletes through nutrition. So that gave me a bit of a sense of shame that I'm not a helping person. I've been part of the problem. So I started to think about what is it that stops me over my 30 years in a career of doing more studies that involve female athletes. And so I put down on paper all the different things that I think make it hard to involve females in research. Whether it's true or not, this is just looking at my perception of it. And first thing I thought, well, they're harder to recruit because they're often busier, they're juggling a lot more things. And often I find that they're less likely to be interested in doing a nutrition study because nutrition means something different to a female than a male. And if I'm doing a study where I want them to eat differently or I want them to eat what I'm giving them for a certain number of days to do the standardization, a lot of females are reluctant to change what they like to do to something I want them to do. There's fewer female athletes of an elite nature, so when you're doing a study, it's often harder to get the sample size that you might think is important. It's very difficult if you're trying to compare them to male counterparts to get them to match on something that's important, because often they do less training or they have a lower aerobic capacity, and so it's harder to match them. There's certainly that problem of the hormonal status, that if we're thinking about different times of the menstrual cycle having an effect on things, it's much harder to be able to make sure that all the females are at the same point of their menstrual cycle. It's going to cost you to test it, and it might mean that you can only do the experiments on certain days to hit the right part of the menstrual cycle. And we may need to assess their nutrition and look for any problems differently than men. And this is just a personal perception. If I look at over all the studies that I've done and thinking about all the participants I've had, sometimes the ones that have been the nightmares in study that are always hard to get on with, or, you know, drop out or seem to create more problems when you're trying to run a busy study, I often think it's the females that are the hardest to get on with. So that was my perception, but I then started to think about looking over some of those studies that I've done to see what's the reality of working with females. And I thought I'd just finish off by giving you an example of one of the studies we've done that involve female athletes. And this was a study that we did around the benefits of taking dairy in the pre-exercise breakfast in terms of calcium metabolism and bones. And it was based on having a problem that we knew that cyclists had poor bone health, and there's aspects of the way that cyclists do their work that aren't good for bones. But we wondered whether the fact that calcium is lost in sweat and that might have an effect on bone metabolism during exercise, had some contribution to make to the poor bone health. And whether, if we were giving calcium before exercise so that it was going into the bloodstream at the same time that the sweat was taking the calcium out of the blood, whether it'd be able to stabilise the concentrations of calcium and stop the bone breakdown. So we had a research question. We also had a practical problem, because at the time we were interested in this, there was a change in the funding model for Australian sport, and the cycling women's team lost all their funding to have their usual camps. And the coach was saying to us, well, what am I going to do? I normally run a talent ID camp. I've got no money anymore. What can we do? And I thought about putting both those problems together and saying, well, what if we got a grant to do a research project that would fund you to have a camp? You could come and do your training camp. We could do the research project within your camp, and then everyone's happy. We've got money to be able to allow you to do what you need to do. And so that's what we did. We had this big study. We had 32 elite female athletes that came into the institute. They were there for a month. Out of that month that they were there, they had 4 days given up to the study, and they were able to do their training on the other days. We did a lot of standardisation, and it was a very busy study trying to look after 32 women at the same time. But I had a lot of help and a lot of very hard-working and creative colleagues to work with, and we were able to pull off this study. Our study looked at the effect of having calcium in the pre-race breakfast versus having a similar breakfast that didn't have any calcium in it. What were the outcomes? Well, the first thing we were able to show was practically, and this was good because a lot of female cyclists don't like to have dairy before they race. They feel that it does something to their stomach, and it might be causing gastrointestinal discomfort. And when we actually measured it, we didn't find that. And so we're able to go back to our females and say, you think that having dairy in your pre-event breakfast is going to be a problem, but in fact it's not. So it's a good thing to do. But in terms of the question that we really set out to ask, we were able to find that putting calcium into the breakfast before going out and racing or riding was able to reduce the amount of bone breakdown that occurred during the cycling. And so that gave us a practical tool to be able to help the bone health with cycling. And that had some very practical messages. We set up some new protocols for use amongst the Australian cycling team that had them taking calcium before they went out on long rides. But we also had a message that we could give to everyday cyclists, the people that have, these men in lycra that buy expensive bikes and go out on weekends and ride. We could now say to them, when you stop at the cafe and have your coffee, make it a milk coffee rather than just an espresso. And there were a lot of sort of serendipitous outcomes that came out of that study. The talent ID component went on to find several cyclists who went on and had very important careers for Australian sport. We had some PhD students who became coaches as part of the study, and we had a sponsor who was very happy with the message that came out of the group. So it was a very, very good study in terms of a whole lot of different important things that could be achieved. And so what did I learn from all the work that I did in putting that presentation together? Well, I think it's really important to have female athletes special research allocated and quarantined. It is challenging. It's more challenging than doing it on male athletes. And so we should have our best scientists doing it because they're the ones that are going to be able to take on those challenges more satisfactorily. There's going to be a whole lot of special questions or special scenarios that we need to address, particularly around solving the hormonal standardisation. And when we find the results, we're going to have to be careful with the way that we communicate them and implement them with female athletes because of the different ways that males and females take on education. But in my experience, there's a lot of really, you don't plan for some of these random outcomes, but some of the research projects that I've done with female athletes have been really rewarding in lots of unexpected ways. And so I'd leave you with the final thought that we need to do better in terms of our research on female athletes. And in particular, I need to do better. So I'll say to you, thank you very much for listening. And I want to thank the female athletes who have been in our studies. I apologise that there haven't been more, but I will put this out as a commitment that I will now go ahead with my future research and make sure that more female athletes are involved and will contribute to the knowledge that we have about sports nutrition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an excellent lecture and a very thought-provoking lecture. I think we need to have research on the athletes or more women athletes. So now we can have some few questions as she has to quite late now in Australia. So are there any questions, Dr. Tyagarajan, from the audience?
Yes, sir. There have been questions coming in. First question is from Malaysia, Dr. Mahendran Ampakuti. He wants to know, is there any specific guidelines if the female athletes want to follow a vegetarian diet?
Well, the first issue would be to think about what sort of vegetarian diet and why does an athlete want to be a vegetarian. And in some cases, there are good cultural and religious reasons for that. And I know a lot of athletes are also interested in sustainability and animal cruelty. But it's important to work out whether those good reasons for being vegetarian are behind the particular athlete's rationale, or whether in fact sometimes vegetarian eating can be used as an excuse to hide disordered eating. One of the hallmarks of disordered eating is athletes restrict the types and amounts of foods that they eat, and they often hide that by pretending that they're following some sort of a diet that other people accept. So I always want to know the reasons why people want to be vegetarian, and happy to support them if that's a good choice, but want to make sure that they realise that it's still important to eat a wide variety of foods and choose well. And particularly for females, getting enough iron and calcium and protein from a vegetarian diet can be challenging. So sometimes we need to find ways in which we can pick iron-rich, protein-rich and calcium-rich foods from vegetable sources and make them more prominent in the diets of female athletes.
Thanks, Dr. Burke. And the next question is from one Mr. Jack Neo. So he's continuing on the calcium supplementation. And in cases of lactose intolerance, would it be just advisable to go ahead with calcium supplementation alone, or anything else could be done? Lactose intolerance.
Okay, so we do think about this strategy as just being one of the things that we can do in terms of bone health. So we particularly like to have it in dairy form or a food form of calcium, because the absorption of the calcium from those sources is different to having a calcium supplement. And for people who are lactose intolerant, in Australia at least, we have quite a large number of different dairy products that come in a low lactose form. So you can buy low lactose milk, you can buy low lactose yogurts. Cheese is a good form of calcium rich dairy that has a very low lactose content. And so there are still ways to have dairy to contribute the calcium without having to have the lactose component.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. And the next question is from Australia itself. Patrick Fahad, the physio. So Patrick wants to know further on the calcium. Is there any plan from you to replicate your study on the calcium supplementation for some other sports which have some high bone stress injury?
Yes, well, that's a good question. One of the reasons that we chose cycling in the first instance was we know that there are more issues around cycling because it is low weight bearing, and so the bone loading effect that comes with some other sports is absent in cycling. But one of the other sports that we're targeting at the moment is rowing, because it's also non-weight bearing. And when we've spoken to experts about our results, they feel that, and we've moved on from thinking that the effect of the exercise session itself is about the sweat loss of calcium. We now know that there's something that happens when people exercise, that at the beginning of exercise, there's a sudden drop in blood calcium levels. And in lots of other sports where there's a bone loading effect, you, at the end of the exercise session, get the stimulus of bone growth from the bone loading. But in cycling and rowing and in swimming, you'd expect not to see that so much. And so this effect that we're seeing during exercise has more of an effect on bone health than in some sports. But one of the things that we're trying to think about now with rowing that's different to cycling is that rowers will do several sessions, often 3 sessions a day of their sport, whereas the cyclists tend to just do 1. And we're thinking about whether the calcium story might be important, spreading it over the day so that every time you're doing a session of exercise, you've got some protection around it from the calcium being replaced, and that that every time you exercise, that needs to happen. So it's the next study that we'll try and do once the world turns back into normal again. We're hoping that we'll be able to get a chance to get some rowers into the institute and work with rowers to see if we can find some ways of helping their bone health through this tactic.
Thanks, Dr. Burke. Probably the last question now, because of want of time. One, Miss Pavitra, she wants to know about the famous Netflix, the documentary Game Changers, about the vegan diet. So what would be your opinion and views on the vegan diet?
Well, look, the Game Changers film, I think, was unfortunately biased. It gave a lot of information about vegan diets that isn't supported by evidence. I certainly feel that there's good reasons for people to think about vegan and vegetarian diets, but as I said, that it needs to be for the right reason. And I'm really interested in people having the most varied and flexible eating patterns that they can. And so if I meet someone who wants to be on a vegan diet because they've seen Game Changers, I would be saying to them, look, there's good things about having vegan meals, but I would be implementing that within a more varied diet so that if you're interested in it because of the effect on the sustainability or animal cruelty, we could find ways in which you could have more, you could include some animal foods in your diet, still meets with your philosophical goals, but allows you to eat a more varied range of foods. But there's, I feel sorry for vegans in some ways because that film was very biased and provided information that really isn't scientifically supported, but it sounded so hyped up that I think a lot of people would have been taken along for the ride without thinking really about the evidence-based knowledge we have about nutrition.
That brings us to the end of the first session. And thanks very much, Dr. Burke. That's all the questions.
A pleasure.
A lot of questions more, but we'll get the questions forwarded to you and get your answers and forward to the delegates.
Again,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much on the behalf of IASM for sharing your valuable experience and in our time and a difficult time. Thanks again.
Okay, bye then.
Bye now. And next is my honor to introduce my good friend, Dr. Marc Portus. He's a founder and managing director of Practice Performance Group. He has 20 years of experience in elite sport leading and managing a high performance team, including being the HP system consultant in the International Cricket Council, the SSM manager at Cricket Australia, and at the Australian Institute of Sports as the head of movement sciences. In fact, when he was the head of the movement science and the Australian sports sciences, I had an opportunity to visit him. Ever since, he's been a good friend and always, in fact, one of reason for our biomechanical lab at Center for Sports Science is getting a lot of acknowledgement and appreciation is the valuable input from Professor Marc Portus, and always grateful for him. And he has a PhD investigating spinal injuries in cricket fast bowlers from University of Western Australia and an executive MBA from Queensland University of Technology. So, Marc Portus, all yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aru, and nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'll just, have I shared my screen? I haven't, have I? Share screen. Okay. All right. You're seeing my screen there, my PowerPoint slide?
Yeah, very well. And we can see you well and also hear you well.
Okay, very good. All right, the art of biomechanics, make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. So this mini lecture is really bringing together a number of facets from my experience and my education and my life, obviously the biomechanics parts, but also around theory of knowledge management as well. Now, just excuse me for a second because I've got a freeze. There we go. All right. So one of the inspirations, I suppose, for this approach I'm going to share today, and comes from Albert Einstein. He was, for just a refresher, was a German scientist, lived from 1879 to 1955, ended up living in America, also became a Swiss resident. And one of the quotes he's famous for is, "Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler." So I credit a lot of the structure of this to that quote from Albert Einstein, who's a very smart man. Some other similar theories is Occam's razor and the law of parsimony. So Occam's razor has been around for a long time, approximately 800 years, and its basic tenet is always choose the simplest. When you're looking at hypotheses and scientific rationale, always choose the simplest hypothesis or the simplest rationale that explains what you're hypothesizing or explains your results. And similarly, law of parsimony is really about what are the variables, what is the theories, what are the mechanisms that can explain the most of the variance of what you're assessing, of what you're studying, or what you're researching, or what you're dealing with. If you're in a clinic with patients, what's the thing that explains the most of the variance from as simple mechanisms as possible. So, for example, a good one is thinking about strength in humans. Generally, strength doesn't need to be tested all throughout the body. Someone who's generally stronger in the upper body will generally be stronger in the lower body, and vice versa. So strength can be explained through the law of parsimony. Obviously, there's some nuances to that, but that's the general concept. Another concept that I'm going to throw at you is called the CANI Framework. And CANI is a Welsh word, so it looks like Cinephin, but it's a Welsh word meaning habitat or place, place of familiarity. And it was developed by a man called Dave Snowden, who's a Welsh academic, comes out of the tech industry. Originally, he used to work for IBM Global Knowledge Management. And over the years, now he's an academic, he's proposed a decision-making framework. So it's a sense-making framework. And I think it really this was really about management and politics initially, but I think it can be applied in the sports medicine, sports science world very well. And I imagine there's quite a few practitioners watching or listening to this. And just think about everything you deal with in your day-to-day, your patients, your athletes. Are they presenting as a complex issue, a challenge, a problem? Are they complicated? Is there an obvious solution? Or are things just chaotic? So just to give you some examples of this sense-making framework, chaotic is when it's usually an emergency or disaster scene. So for example, the tragic accidents of 9/11 in New York in 2001, that day, that was a chaotic day. The complex is really an area where things aren't, this cause and effect isn't easy to tell. And this would be, I think it gets as practitioners dealing with human beings, complex and complicated is where we're sitting mostly. So complex, there's no real clear cause and effect. Things can emerge that we don't expect. There's lots of intricate, lots of intricate, complex interrelationships driving things, and things can change. then complicated is where our expertise and our technical nous can help us solve solutions, and that's governed by our good practice. And then there's obvious, which is the obvious quadrant down the bottom right. And that's really where there's an easy cause and effect. So for example, a call center, say a bank's call center, they're dealing mostly in that obvious quadrant where, you know, you can't log into your app for your bank, and you need to have a bank password reset, or you need to re-download the app. That's sort of in the obvious space. And then on the right, same framework, but just showing you the blue is considered unordered and the orange is considered ordered. And we'll deal with a little bit more of that soon. So really, as I said, with the human, dealing with humans as quite evolved beings, I think we're dealing mostly in complicated and complex systems in sports science and sports medicine. There's just a couple of diagrams I came across today when I was just having a cruise on the net about complicated and complex systems and the differences. And I think these two diagrams show reasonably nicely that complicated is very highly technical, quite specialist, but there's clear dependencies, things. The blue boxes are feeding into different color boxes and triangles and circles, etc. It's a clear sort of cause and effect. It might not be obvious and might not be clear to the average person, the lay person, but to an expert, to a technical specialist, there is a cause and effect and some sort of flow-on effect of events. In terms of complex, it's a mishmash. It's things emerge. There's no clear cause and effect. Things can change rapidly, and that can be happening now. So, for example, look at coronavirus, the pandemic. Is it complicated or is it complex? I think in some aspects there's some things we can control with technical expertise. Obviously, here in Australia, there's a lot of high-profile health experts helping the government make decisions and make policies about social distancing and the like. But there's elements of complexity, and the development of a vaccine, for example, I understand is still another year away, perhaps. So that's an area of complexity that they're trying to move into the complicated. To give us some other real-world examples, an Airbus A380, that's a complicated machine. So it's very highly specialized, it's very technical. You need a lot of engineers and a lot of computer science, a lot of science involved in putting an Airbus A380 together and flying and making it safe. But that's complicated. Mayonnaise is complex. So there's an analogy it's not my analogy, but I've heard before and I quite like it. Complex is hard to pull it apart. It's hard to see the cause and effect. What it is an interrelationship of a whole series of ingredients that come together and merge as one, and all the things merged together is greater than the individual parts. So greater than the oil, greater than the eggs, greater than the vinegar, greater than whatever else you put in. So there's a couple of reasonably good analogies there. I think complicated, Airbus, complex, mayonnaise. So what does all this mean in terms of biomechanics? Well, given we're talking to an Indian audience, amongst others, I know there's others around the world there, I'll use the great sport of cricket as an example. So there's a little graphic showing the 5 of the fastest bowlers in the world that there's been in the last 30 or 40 years. And Shaun Tait is in that graphic, is the second from the right. He's clocked at over 160 kilometres per hour. And sometimes has been known in his career, he's finished bowling now. For those that don't know cricket that well, Shaun Tait was an Australian fast bowler, finished about 6 or 7 years ago. And he was a big, strong lad and had quite a unusual action, and but bowled very fast. But got called the wild thing. So, and the element about him was he sometimes it wasn't clear if he knew where the ball was going, but that was part of his armory in some ways, because if he doesn't know, how's the batsman going to know? So he bowled fast, and some days he bowled superbly, and other days not quite as good. But one little involvement I've had with him over his career, I think, serves about how biomechanics can be made simple and can be translated into the field, which is what we're talking about here. I'm going to talk about the illegal action law and Shaun Tait. To just give those people a refresher who are familiar and those who are not familiar, cricket bowling needs to be bowled with say a straight arm in inverted commas. Can't throw like a baseball pitcher. And these series of images here from the left to the right show a bowler at the horizontal through to ball release, or just prior to ball release on the right hand side. And the illegal action law in world cricket essentially states that once the bowler's arm hits the horizontal, so that leftmost image, that's almost like their baseline, their elbow baseline. And so if you measure it, think of if the elbow was perfectly straight, it'd be 180 degrees. So whatever that elbow angle is when that upper arm hits the horizontal, it's considered their baseline. And then they've got 15 degrees of elbow straightening tolerance, so elbow extension that they can use between horizontal and ball release. So incidentally, when this law was introduced, there was a fair bit of uproar because people were saying, well, the bowler's not supposed to throw at all. There shouldn't be any straightening, zero tolerance. But some research that I was involved with demonstrated that pretty much all bowlers, even bowlers that were considered had very pure, clean bowling actions, didn't throw at all, no hint of throwing, still had some elbow extension around about 8 or 9 degrees. So that's the phase we're talking about there. That's the critical phase, and that's what gets analysed when an elite bowler goes into a biomechanics laboratory. And there's one of those, an ICC approved one of those at the Centre of Sports Science in Chennai, our hosts tonight. Now with Shaun, he did have a few little issues. He never got banned. He never got biomechanically tested or reported for a suspect bowling action, but there was a bit of talk, and actually early in his career, before he was famous, he did have a problem. He actually did have a problem. As I was lucky enough to work at the Australian Institute of Sport at the time, and all the fast bowlers coming through the academy would go through for a biomechanical analysis in our laboratories, and Shaun Tait was one of those young fast bowlers that came through. So every year we'd have 15 or 20 young fast bowlers coming through, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. We didn't really know them. They hadn't played for their state yet, but they were considered potential players of interest. And Shaun was one of them, and he actually did have a bit of a chucking issue back then. Now just look at this picture of Shaun. So it's striking the similarity between the position he's actually in there, right in the heat of battle, and compare that to a baseball pitcher on the right. And the thing I really want you to look at, there's quite a few similarities there, but the thing I want you to look at is the way they're holding the ball. The ball is on top of the hand in both pictures. And with Shaun, he held, back in the early days when he was a youngster, a teenager, he held that ball in that position quite a way through, even up past the horizontal. So with baseball pitchers, that's quite normal. That's a normal throwing mechanic. And one of the effects it's doing is it's giving the a lot of longitudinal rotation around the upper arm and around the forearm. So it's just a manifestation of the internal external rotation going on at the shoulder and the pronation supination going on through the forearm. So, and as you can see, you look at most baseball pitchers, that hand is holding the ball down towards the ground. So the palm's on top of the ball. So you can see there in all those pictures, just highlighted there, that ball in that same position, which Shaun Tait was holding as well. But the advantage, obviously, that baseball pitchers have is they can do that. And obviously, there's some pretty high stress positions there. And if there's some specialists in shoulders and elbows, You're probably familiar with this, but you know, there's a lot of torque going on there around the shoulder and around the elbow in particular from those positions, but they can throw from high speed. So these guys don't have a run up, much like the cricket fast bowler does. So they've got to generate a lot of momentum, a lot of force, a lot of torque in essentially one stride. So it's quite stressful on those upper limbs. But they have the advantage where that elbow can bend and straighten a lot. The fast bowler doesn't have that advantage. So this is Shaun Tait, back to the bowling example. And you can see where he's on the very left image, his hand's still on top of the ball, but he's starting to rotate around. Now, when he was a kid, he was pretty much, still had his hand on top of the ball, really where that middle image there was. So in effect, he was getting quite a similar mechanism, not as exaggerated as the baseball pitches, but he was getting that real kink and flick and flick in his bowling action. So that, and when we actually measured his elbow before he was even a state cricketer, and he was above the 15-degree elbow tolerance threshold. So with him, the key thing was the changeover, and this is where my opening points about simplicity. There was plenty of things going on in Shaun Tait's bowling action, but the first thing that after a number of reviews and discussing with the coaches was just to see, could a simple direction and instruction for him to actually start turning a hand over earlier in that swing help him? And it did. It was quick and it was simple, and it was one of the best and simplest innovations I've ever been involved with. Interventions I've been involved with a fast bowler. And he understood it, and he could do it, and he fixed it straight away. And really, for the rest of his career, he had no more problems and still bowled exceptionally fast. The other example I want to talk about is foot strikes. Another example from biomechanics. This is quite a hot topic, has been for a number of years. And whether you're a heel striker, a midfoot striker, or a forefoot striker, gets talked about a lot. And there's a lot of people discussing the advantages of moving away from being a rear foot striker. What I want to show you now is just this video of some Ethiopian runners running around a track. Now, if you can on your videos there, I hope you can see that clearly enough. Just have a look at these. So these are in a population that's well known for its ability to run, highly economical, highly successful and around the world. Have a look at all the different foot strike patterns you can see here in these Ethiopian distance runners running on the track. So already I can see some forefoot strikers, I can see some heel strikers, and I can see some midfoot strikers. It's actually quite varied. So the similar population, it's a population that's similar to India is known with its cricket, or Australia is known with its cricket. Ethiopia, with its long distance runners, is known as a hotbed of talent. So if there's so much diversity in techniques of the best in the world, why do we've got all these proponents telling us that we should move away from heel striking? Well, you'll see some graphs around, and you'll see some graphs on the left there of heel strike and then forefoot strike. And there's actually some different force curves there, and I'll show you, particularly in that top left one, there's a little spike. And generally, when you use force plates and assessing gait, and a heel striker, they'll have an extra little spike there. So that red circle showing an extra little spike in terms of the body weights of force, the impact forces that's experienced by the person using the heel strike mechanism, and the rate of that force is quicker. And then the theory goes that if you go forefoot, you'll smooth out the spike, the slope won't be as steep, so the rate of force development isn't as fast, so it's less stressful on your body. Something to think about in terms of Louise's lecture she just gave about bone mineral density and calcium input as well with cyclists and rowers. Obviously, those guys aren't having the impact forces and the loading mechanisms that's happening here with running. So should we be changing to mid or forefoot strike? Is it important to avoid heel striking? And there's some fierce proponents of this around the world. You look at this graph on the left though, and it shows you, yes, the black line has a heel strike with a sharper curve, a sharper slope there, steeper slope going up. But the grey doesn't have that little peak, but it has actually a higher level of impact force, vertical ground reaction force throughout the duration of the stride of the support stance. So there's a bit more stress going on actually through the stance of the foot. So to blindly recommend that everyone should be avoiding heel striking is really creating a simple solution for a complex problem. It can present a risk of stress-related injuries, and the foot strike position is not a predictor of running injuries so far. In all research to date, it hasn't actually predicted a higher rate of injuries. So yes, there's some factors that are higher with heel striking than the forefoot strike or the midfoot strike, but it's not as simple as conclusive as to try and move everyone who runs away from a heel striking position. So as I say to you, it's complicated, or is it complex? These are all the factors that are really involved. So if you look from the top left, there's natural running style. And this is an area that's been investigated in the research over the last few years, is if someone's a natural rear foot striker, or a midfoot striker, can they easily transfer across to a front foot striking style? What does that do to their loading? What does that do to their stiffness? What does it do to their compliance? So one thing that they find is with rear foot strikers, the ankle becomes quite stiff, and the knee joint becomes quite compliant. With forefoot strikers, it's the other way around. The ankle is quite stiff and the knee becomes more compliant. The speed they're running at, the distance that they run. So obviously for sprinters, all sprinters are on the forefoot. We're talking about distance athletes, but pain, force, and stress. And even in some studies, we've found that over longer distances, that runners actually change during the event themselves. So the anatomy and physiology is important. Obviously, the softer tissues can get loaded up with the front foot strike, can create calf problems, Achilles problems, plantar fascia problems. Running economy can change, and running economy has been one that's been hypothesized that will be more efficient in a forefoot strike. But again, that's been highly variable and no conclusive evidence on that. And then the environment is important as well. So the climate, the types of shoes, minimalist shoes through to barefoot and through to high cushioning shoes, they all have different effects with different people. So that's something to think about. So if I come back to my original framework and my original proposition to you about the CANI Framework, and I'll look at those two examples of Shaun Tait's late changeover, so that issue of his hand coming over a bit late and creating a kink and a flick in his bowling action when he was a teenager. Back then it was probably complicated, back when we were looking at this issue, but I'd suggest now that it's reasonably obvious, and that's probably just an example of best practice. That's something to look at. One of the first things you look at when you've got an illegal action bowler, how late is that hand changing over when it's gripping the ball through that upswing, and that's how knowledge evolves, and how your decision making and your treatment of patients or athletes evolves with your knowledge, and they can move from being complex to complicated to obvious as practice evolves and knowledge evolves. In terms of forefoot, changing foot strike pattern, we're I would suggest it's probably sitting still in the complex. We're starting to make some inroads into some knowledge, but there's still a lot of things we don't understand about it. But that, I think with time and a fair bit of research, it's going to move into the complicated area. All right, thank you very much. That's me done.
Thank you, Dr. Marc Portus, for the excellent lecture and elegant one. Whenever we talk to you, you always make biomechanics very simple, but it's for many of us. That's why we keep wanted to talk to you and get your input in all our work. And it's quite late now back in Australia. I think probably we take questions for Dr. Marc Portus now. Dr. Tyagarajan, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, sir. There are, in fact, a lot of questions. So we have picked up a few.
Okay.
Utkarsh from CSS itself wants to know the new skill, say front foot drive, involves coaching skill also. How biomechanics can fit into this paradigm, as there is a lot of variability in batting, especially.
Yes. So was that the front foot drive in cricket?
Yeah, for front.
Yeah. So I think biomechanics, you should think of biomechanics on a continuum of skill types. So fast bowling and spin bowling, it's more of a closed skill in that the bowler executes their skill. They do respond a little bit to the batsman and what the batsman's doing, and especially in 2020 cricket, it's becoming probably more open. But batting is a lot more of an open skill because it's responding to movements and the projectile from the ball from the bowler. So they have to respond. So we call that an open skill. So they have to detect, get the cues and make their decision. So things like skill acquisition become, it's very important. I think I view biomechanics and skill acquisition like brother and sister. They're very important together, and especially down that more open skill end of the spectrum. So in terms of developing drives, I think biomechanics can play a role, but also I think there's a lot of there's a big role for intuition, for probing and sensing. Getting back a bit to that CANI framework, is actually just trying things out and seeing what works for the player, and giving them stimulus and creating environments that represent what the batter's going to face in the real game. So whether that's mixing it up with short balls, mixing it up with different swing deliveries, mixing it up in different pitch types, that's all important. That becomes more important, and I think biomechanics sort of just slides more into the background for batting. It's still important and still plays a role. I mean, some of these batsmen these days and batters are using sensational techniques and pulling off sensational skills. But the skill acquisition and the motor control is actually really important there as well.
Thanks, Marc. The second question is from Dr. Grace. The front force peak ground reaction forces are enormous, 6 to 8 times of the body weight. But to overcome that, if we keep the knee bent, it results in loss of energy transfer, especially in javelin throw. So what are the measures the athlete should think of?
Yeah, so the braced front knee is talked about importantly, and it's interesting to see a lot of those pictures of baseball pitchers, and most of those baseball pitchers who are pitching 90 to 100 miles per hour have got a bent front leg. So the mechanisms are quite different, but the javelin thrower and the fast bowler do have that one thing in common, where that braced front leg will help, but there's a trade-off there. So, and that's where your strength and conditioning, your pelvic control, the core, lower body strength, the plyometric strength, the ability to absorb those high rates of force development is really critical. So a multifactorial approach, a multidisciplinary approach of a fast bowler as an athlete is critical, because you will need them to be strong. You need them to be able to have the necessary stiffness to bowl fast, because that front leg's obviously operating like a big rigid lever. But having said all that, don't forget there's some extremely fast bowlers that bowled over a bent front leg as well. Shoaib Akhtar's one, Shaun Tait is another. So there's not one solution that fits all. And that's where I think the topic of this, make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. I think an example is if you try and get all fast bowlers to bowl over a rigid straight front leg, you're oversimplifying the issue. It needs to work for that player. It needs to work for that bowler. Their injury history is important. Their physical conditioning is important. Their status. So they're things to consider.
Thanks, Marc. The next question is from a spine surgeon, Dr. Karthik Kailash from India. He wants to know about tennis serve, the role of biomechanics in a drop elbow leading to cock up. As compared to an elevated elbow, what would be the difference on the impact of shoulder injury?
In tennis, was it?
Yeah, in tennis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And look, I think it's highly individualized again as well. So that internal and external rotation, coupled with the tennis racket in the hand, is creating a moment of inertia that's far greater because of that. It's got that extra leverage at the end of the hand. So again, I think my answer, I'm sorry to be a bit boring here, but my answer is reasonably similar to my previous one in that it depends on the athlete, depends on the elbow, depends on their status. There could be an easy fix there. Yeah, so it's complicated.
Okay, Marc. The next question is from Shubham. The sprinters, they should run on forefoot or long distance on midfoot. What would you like to comment about this?
Well, I think Jeff, it's generally well accepted and pretty well demonstrated that sprinters will be at least midfoot to forefoot. They've got to have that quick contact time. They can't spend longer than they need to on the ground. And the middle distance runners, I think it's horses for courses. You'll find some middle distance runners that will still heel strike, and they're perfectly fine doing it. And to change them can create more problems than it's worth. Now, if they've got problems, I'm not saying don't change them, but make sure you take a multi-dimensional view of it, understanding how the athlete's injury history is, what are the condition of all the soft tissues around those joints of the ankle and the knee. Can they understand that if you're going to change a runner, you're going to change the loading on that runner. So if they've got a runner that's got a propensity to shin splints, for example, or calf strains, and you're going to move them from being from a rear foot to a forefoot striker, you're actually might be presenting more of a risk to that player, to that person, to injure themselves even more. So that's where I think the technical expertise and the multidisciplinary approaches are best.
Thanks, Marc. The final two questions about pronated ankle or pronated foot. Will that add to the problems?
Yeah, so it can do, but there's pronation. Pronation is a natural running mechanic. So to have some pronation is okay. It's whether it's having a detrimental effect up the kinetic chain. So what's the effect it's having on the ankle joint, on the shank and the knee, and that can increase loading right through up into the pelvis and the lumbar spine. So yes, you want to avoid excessive amounts of pronation, but it's not something you want to stop or reduce. It's actually a normal part of the of natural running mechanics, and it's part of this force absorption mechanism of the body. And
Marc, there's a final question. Though there are hundreds of questions, I think it will come. Ashish asks about barefoot running. Is it good? What's your take on it?
On barefoot
running.
Say it again for me. I don't understand.
Barefoot running.
Oh, barefoot.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, look, again, it's going to be okay for some people. Some people swear by it. But some people, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. So it's one of those things where use the CANI Framework, probe, sense, respond. If you think it's going to help someone in terms of their performance, make sure you do it with open eyes. Make sure what you're doing. You're working closely and in a measured approach, and be prepared to pull out of it.
Okay, that's it from the question panel, sir.
Thank you very much, Marc. It's always a pleasure to see you and interact with you. I hope to do it more often in a more close manner. And again, on behalf of IASM, I take this opportunity to thank you for taking valuable time in a difficult time. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Aru. Thank you, Dr. Cat.
Thank you.
Evening all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jolly Roy, who is a professor of sports psychology at Center for Sports Science, Sri Ramchandra University. He is an elected managing council member of the World Body, the International Society of Sports Psychology. She was previously served as a senior consultant at National Sports Institute of Malaysia and as a sports scientist in Sports Authority of India. She has a PhD and master's degrees in psychology and in psychiatric social work. She trained in sports psychology in the Research Institute for Olympic Sports in Finland and in Florida State University, USA. Dr. Roy, I welcome you for this webinar.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks for this opportunity. So today my lecture would be about $1 million question. Is there an X factor in sports performance? The answer is something we have to decide at the end. But keeping in view with the main theme that from the lab to the field, what I'm going to share here is some of my practical work that we do here or in my previous institutes, and finally, how we gain the regulation and control for these athletes. And let's see how it goes. So I would work across the slides on how we prepare an athlete and with a few examples which I'll be giving in there. So my contents would be on a basic small introduction, common psychological problems, and systematic training and professional practice. So the X factor in sports. So just to begin with, we don't have this in any of the textbooks. So we just picked up an operational definition, which is some quality that can impact an outcome in a huge way. And that's what could be the X factor. It could be an ability to add value to the performance or to a team. Now, the main components of the sports, of course, physical, physiological, there are two pillars. Then you have the skill level. And here I would be dealing only with the psychological aspects, the mental readiness, regulation and control, and more how we gain the control to bounce back. Now, X factor, people would wonder, is it a myth or a reality? The myth is that psychology is a random performance factor. That's what everybody feels many of the times. But now, slowly, it is changing. The reality is that psychological skill needs to be systematically trained just as a sports or a physical skill. So what are the common issues in competitive sports? These are just few that are given, the one which are frequently reported by coaches or athletes: attention control, arousal regulations, mood and emotion regulations, self-confidence, and mental toughness. When these get affected, there's a result as choking in sports. And choking is very recently introduced new word, not that it was not happening, but the research is still on why does this happen and how does it happen. So we don't have an answer for all that happened, but let's see how it comes. Now, choking in sports, right now what they say, operationally, they define it as a sudden, unexpected failure in performance due to anxiety under high pressure situation. So what does an athlete experience? High arousal, very high anxiety. There's a total attention narrowing, tunnel vision kind of thing. And however much the athlete tries, the performance becomes worst. And the most important thing is the difficulty to bounce back or to regain control. And here they need probably an outside assistance. Now, how does athlete manifest choking? You could see changes in the breathing rate, pounding heart, muscle stiffness, inability to focus, perspiration, or even sometimes the athletes are baffled, disappointed. These are some of the common things that I'm telling. Now, how do sports psychologists train an athlete to regulate and gain control? So you see on the left side, this picture, this is our laboratory sports psychology lab in the making in Ramchandra Sports Science Center, Chennai. So we do have this lab-based training, which leads to an effective execution of skills in the different sports. Now, what happens between this is what is my subsequent slides going to show. When we start with psychology training, we also have something like a planning, like when an athlete comes in, and if this athlete has never gone through any systematic or formal psychological skill training, we work on the preparatory phase, competitive transition phase. So it's during the general preparation that they have plenty of time, and we teach them all the different skills. So these each of these cylinder, it only just represents, only a representation. The volume is what matters. And as they go to specific, we reduce it. When they go into competitive context, we tell them to pick what suits them the best. And when they are in the main competition, the MC, they pick only what is required. And when they go for transition, even further down, they just use one or two to maintain. When they come back, we don't give them again the whole thing. We only pick what is required. But if the athlete is young, or if the athlete is already trained with somebody, then we don't have to start from the beginning. We can start right from here. So this is the basic outline with which we work. So when we work, this is, if any of the psychologists are listening, this is nothing new. This is the Whaley's model. There are different models different psychologists work with, but I work particularly in this model. So I'll be giving examples, one or two examples from each model, so that in the 15 minutes what is allotted, we could try to cover as much as possible. So let's go first to the foundation skills. When they come, achievement drive, motivation, self-awareness, productive thinking, self-confidence, there's so many of them, but it's just a few things. Now, motivation, many times when coaches come and see me, they would say, we showed this video, we had this kind of motivational techniques, we had this motivational talk, but nothing seems to work. And then I'll tell you why it doesn't work. So when you look at the motivation, you have the social factors and psychological mediators, which leads into motivation. And of course, the consequences. We are not going to deal with the main theory, but when we look at it in Ramchandra, when we look at motivation on this continuum, on how does it connect with the self-determination. So you have A, motivation, extrinsic and intrinsic. But under this, we still have, under extrinsic particularly, you have 3 full levels. And then you have the intrinsic. And now they have gone to the next level, which is passion in sports, which is not under this model, but it's the new development, harmonious passion and obsessive passion. So herein, I would just give an example of, if an athlete is here, identified, how we do have lab measures and questionnaires or mathematical calculation to identify, but if you don't have that, if you're traveling with the team, how do you still identify either from a behavior or from a conversation? So in the next slide is only about how I'll be dealing with this 2 level and how you can differentiate it just by talking to an athlete. For instance, if an athlete is talking to you, I'm doing this to stay in the team, though it's my off day. I have to work out to improve my speed, strength, and endurance. If these are the kind of statements which is coming, you know that athlete does not perceive it as an interesting activity, but he or she knows that it is instrumental to achieve another goal. So that's what is called identified regulation. And if you go to the next level, the athlete would be saying, I have to do this activity. I want to practice. I have set my goal and I want to achieve it. Now you see the difference in the statements. And this shows the free will with which he or she is doing it. So you see the difference which come here between this level, though we talk about extrinsic, is very obvious even from a conversation. If you don't, if it's not a psychologist who's analyzing it, you can still be able to identify from this. And this is why sometimes if you go to the left side of the continuum, no matter whatever motivational talks you do, it will not work because his regulatory status are very different. Now let's look at self-awareness. What self-awareness is important to balance the demand and the resource. Now the different sports has different demands, different levels. So if the athlete does not have a personal resource to meet this demand, then there is an imbalance. Now, previous years, we used to work on controlling the negatives and things like that. But now there is a slight change, and we have started using, we started working on what are the strengths that you have and how do you use your strength to overcome the remaining thing. So he has to be aware about his strengths, and that's about self-awareness, productive thoughts. How to grow personally during adversity. On a normal day, it would be okay, but it's during adversity, the problem comes. So for instance, my worst is still better than the best of my opponent. These are the kind of productive thoughts which we replace when athletes comes out with the negative thoughts. This is just one example that I've given. Self-confidence. Many times coaches come and say, my athlete is very confident, but we don't know what happens in the game. You see, the self-confidence has to be seen as global self-confidence and situational self-confidence. On a normal day, an athlete can be very confident, but on a game day, when the context change, he or she can slump. And that brings us, how do we develop the self-confidence or self-efficacy? This is something like a coronavirus. If you don't know the source of it, we won't know how to develop it. Now, that's what is happening. It's not that we have the best of the medical staff and doctors, but when you don't know the source, it's exactly like that how it works. These are the sources which develop the self-efficacy. So if someone's confidence has to be developed, you have to work on these sources. And then what we see outside is only a behavior pattern or a thought pattern. Having said this, I need to caution you that high self-efficacy does not always translate into a win. It just increases your probability that an athlete will do well or he will be able to control well. So this is what it does. But all these things can be mathematically calculated. And this is one example of one of the athletes which I worked with in the month of May. We have converted the values in the lab to a percentage so that it is easy for athletes or parents to understand. And you see the difference can be seen on how much of self-efficacy changes have taken place. So this is a kind of evidence that I'm giving you. Now, when we go to the next skill, which is performance skill, this is a very important skill where we work a lot on this energy management, stress energy balance, because this affects your arousal, this affects your attention, this affects your perceptions. Now, when coaches or athletes come, they say we're tense, we're nervous, we're stressed, we're anxious, we're arousal, activation. They come out with all kinds of words. So in terms of psychology, for us, these are all words which everybody uses in common, but these are slightly different. Like when you say stress, we're talking about a non-specific response. When you say anxiety, they're talking about subjective feeling. Arousal is actually a continuous state of fluctuation of a body process. And activation is actually episodic, short-term change. Just to say that it's all different when a psychologist read it from or hear it from them. So let's work on the arousal. Now, how is arousal generated? We have an athlete who is skilled, who's got fitness, who's got his own personal experiences. But when he goes to the sports situation or the context, there is the task difficulty and the demand what he understands. So the moment he sees this, there is a cognitive evaluation that takes place, which includes the demand, the resource, consequences, meaning of consequence. What does it mean if I win? And what does it mean if I lose? And the body reaction starts. So here you can see cognition leading to emotions and physiological responses and vice versa. And you could see heart rate going up, muscle tensions, brain wave changing from alpha to other waves, skin conductance. So these are things that happen. But what we see on the field is only a behavior, motor performance, digression from there, wrong decision making, wrong perception. You're not able to retain your learned material. Many times coaches come and tell, till yesterday he was doing everything perfect. We don't know what happened to him today. You see, and I've also seen in my practice where coaches try to correct the technique. Obviously, I'm not saying it's wrong to correct the technique, but on the game day, when they have perfected a technique, it's probably not just the technique that's going wrong. It's probably an arousal level which has to be, reduced or increased depending upon the game and the task that you're doing. And if you have understood this, at least 50%, how do we regulate them? There are many measures to do that, but what we do, breathing is one of the simplest things that they can do when they are in the field. So from the lab, we can teach them so many things. So what we do is we have different types of breathing. I've just put 2, 3 over here, 5 to 1 count breathing, 1 to 2 ratio breathing, sighing with exhalation. So an athlete can choose, we teach them everything in the lab, but tell the athlete to choose what best suits him so that he can bring down his arousal as and when it is required. Now here I have some data which you can see how the athletes have brought down their breathing cycle. And this is actually data from an Olympic archery team where I worked in the previous institute. We also teach them the basic relaxation. I've just brought this so because the moment we say contract your muscles, they immediately contract it. And that's not how it has to be done. It has to be done very systematically. So we show them these pictures. We show them, see here also. So just a couple of pictures to show when we teach them relaxation, how they have to go with a count 1, 2, 3, 4. This is another team where I was working with. So where we initially, if they don't know how we start training them, so they have it with lying down position, then we train them on sitting down position, even on a standing position, because in a game situation, you won't have chance to lie down. But when we are traveling with the team, you could see here, this is in one of the hotels where you could see we had used a corridor because sometimes when we are traveling with the team, we don't have a sports psychology lab or a room. So we may have to use the available resources. So this is on site. And some institutes, they have the flotation tank to teach. In case you don't have that, you can always use a jacket and even a swimming pool if you feel like relaxation. So there is no excuse that you can't do something what we do in the lab, in the field. We also teach them arousal regulation just by using a stopwatch. All we need to tell them is on a resting day, ask them to estimate 10 seconds in your mind, ask them to show it without seeing it, and have their resting value. Say, for instance, his resting value was 10, to give that as a target. This is an actual value which is done in our center here in Chennai, where a shooter is trying to regulate himself and trying to see. So this is a data. We give this as home assignments and they do it home and they bring it back when they come here. And you could see here, he's very close by, but he's still not got his target. So I've just put only one slide because of want of time. Another exercise, you could use a candle, you could use a flashlight, you could use anything. Again, these are 2 rifle shooters who are under the Kalo India. And this is how they have trained. You see, they set a goal, they see how much time they can hold on to it. This is how they train, they're focusing when they are at home or even when they are traveling with the team. So they have the goal set and they see the achievement. So these are monitored by us as well as by them. Now you see, we have a lot of these great athletes. Having said this, for all of them, in some way or other, they have developed their regulations, their control, either by themselves or with the help of coach or with the help of psychologists, either from India or abroad. But all of them, in some way or other, would have gone through it and would have developed the mental toughness. Now, this data down here is, now, I do not want anyone to mistake that this can be done only with high performance. The data that I'm showing you here is a 13-year-old swimmer who was seeing me in Ramchandra in our center. And you see the blue, the first time when she came, this is how, you see, these are the areas which we needed to work. And by the time she finished after a couple of months, we had 15 sessions with her. She had already gone up to level 5. So these are evidence that these monitorings work. And once we know that this is there, they are already trained to be independent. They can do it on their own when they are traveling, because we don't all the time get to travel with the teams. The next one is personal development skill. One of the main things you see here is identity achievement. That is, a lot of athletes come with injury. They were one of the best athletes, but after injury, probably they feel upset. The coach is not looking at them. They are in pain. They go through a lot of it. So their athletic identity itself gets affected. So this is one data of one athlete. When he came first to us, we monitor. There's a lot of mood changes that you would see, and you can see here how when he came first, the depression level, and throughout the rehab, you see how it comes down here, how they have the anger, because all this time they were the best players and now they are out, totally out. So we do monitor their mood fluctuations. This is for during the injury, and especially when they are going back, return to the field, you could see a little bit of confusion start coming up and things like that. We also teach them imagery. These are again our athletes. So before they go in for some of the rehab, we work alongside the rehab athletes, give them the imagery of what they can do, and which makes it easier, because there are researchers which says the mind and the body, if it is connected and in harmony, they work together. This is another example of how we work with a rehab athlete. This is our physiotherapist giving instructions here and also demonstrating. And then I do the imagery and then they do the rehab. So these are live examples what I'm giving from my own personal experience, professional practice over here. Coming to intrapersonal competence, we teach cognitive restructuring by, when athletes, I asked them, what do you do when you have a bad shot? They would say, I say to myself, try your best. So we say, instead of that, why don't you go in for an action word? What action would you take? Don't get frustrated. Don't slam the rifle. Stay determined, stay well. So we change, we give a new direction to their thoughts. That's how a cognitive restructuring is done, by replacing the instructions to new directions. Finally, the team skills. You may be wondering, how do we know who's the leader of the team? Cohesion, communication. There are measures which we can identify. So this is a team, and each of this AMAA, these are the initials of athletes. We can mathematically calculate the distance from here and where exactly the position, the social position in the team. I'll give you an example. This athlete is way away from all of them. But if athlete AB, number 14, is, for instance, a very potential and good player, and that coach wants him in, and he's not integrated with the team, it's time that psychologists would intervene to make sure that the right communication is happening, and he's integrated into the team. This is like what we call in our language, the isolate in the team. Now, take for example, maybe number 5 is the captain by way of federations or seniority. But then from psychology point, we also see who are at this point, because these are the psychological leaders of the team. When we will have to get to work with the team, we can use these psychological leaders to reach out to the team. So even in a team, we could work out on how to, even when they have to be in different rooms, when they're traveling, we can even look at the sociometry. Yes, it's a little sensitive. We maintain the confidentiality and we only tell this to the coaches, but this is exactly, and even coaches can know whom they can pair with and whom they cannot. So a lot of things that they can get into this. So with this, coming to the final 2 slides, the X factor is systematic psychological training. Don't ignore the mental skills. Don't force mental training on any athletes. And if they come to psychologists or any one of us, we individualize the mental training program for them because each athlete is unique. And the take-home message is physical skills don't develop overnight, neither do the mental skills. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for the enlightening lecture with a very clear message on a difficult topic of sports psychology. We'll take questions at the end of the next talk. Okay. I take my pleasure inviting our next speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Karuna Datta. She is a professor of sports medicine and in charge of Human Sleep Research Lab, AFMC Pune. She's done her PhD at AIMS, and she is trained in sleep medicine at Harvard Medical School, USA. Dr. Datta, okay. I request you to give your talk.
I'm unable to share my video.
Can you see yeah.
I'm not able to share my video though.
We can see your
slides.
Yes. PowerPoint. If you go to a slide show.
Yeah, but I think my video is not coming. I'm not able to show it. It's saying that the host has stopped it.
Dr. Tyagarajan?
Yeah, it's just come.
Yeah.
Karuna, you can start your video. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for thinking about sleep and sports. Has the slide gone to the... Yes. So, as we just saw a very interesting talk by the sleep psychologist, how mental skills are important and how we can have a lot of effect for the issue of the lack.
Dr. Karuna, your voice is a bit low. Can you come closer to and talk, please?
Yes. Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better. Thank you.
Okay. So we just saw in the previous talk the role of the mental skills. And in the next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to discuss what is the role of sleep in enhancing sports performance. Now, what do we know about sleep in sports and sleep in sports? What happens in sleep of sports person? Can it enhance performance? And what should be the way forward is the talk today. So we don't have to say much. We've heard it from our own Olympians who have given a lot of importance to how sleep can affect performance. And either it can be a cause or it can be the effect. But whatever the problem be in sleep, it will affect performance is definitely known. So with this background, the effects of a bad sleep can be on learning and memory, can be on cognition. There can be micro sleep episodes where a person while awake can actually go into a micro sleep episode and not register. And hence, in a sports field, on a sports field, all these things are very important for his training. Where the alertness gets affected, even learning for that matter gets affected, and whatever he has been taught, he might just forget at that point in time. The decision-making skills can get affected because of lack of sleep or a bad sleep or a sleep deprivation, which is also done by himself. The mood changes, and also you might find that there may be a lot of loss or the effects may be because of many other factors. Like there may be something like a basal sleepiness, that he's already not caught up his sleep or his requirement for sleep is more. And in that case, he may have effects earlier than an individual who's otherwise not that sleepy. Then amount of sleep restriction that he might have done, his own susceptibility, age, motivation, posture, arousal influences. Now, arousal influences is a very important thing because we just heard in our previous talk how arousal can make an impact and how the entire physiology of the individual may not be so conducive for good performance.
Dr.
So,
Karuna, sorry for interruption.
yes.
From delegates, there is a issue that audio is not clear. Do you have any headphones?
I think I can just switch off the fan. Just a minute.
Yes, please. If you switch off the fan, the background noise will go off. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll do. Is it better now? Is the sound better?
Yeah, slightly better.
Okay.
There was a lot of background noise.
Maybe it must be the fan.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
right, thank you. So to just sum up whatever that I have covered, we just discussed that sleep affects performance and there can be many influences and mostly it is individual susceptibility which matters. Now we were at arousal influences, which has been discussed how arousal can actually affect performance and how mental training was helpful in reducing arousal. And if there is an arousal, it is likely to affect sleep. And there can be a lot of influences like the activity. If you have planned an activity just before sleep, the person is going to be aroused, would not be able to sleep well. Bright light at night time, noise, temperature, caffeine, drugs, and group effects. Now, group effects is something which is very interesting because, when we are in teams, we're all going in groups. And even at night, when your coach says that, okay, go off to sleep, that's the time the sports people are actually gossiping, chatting, WhatsApping. And these are these group effects of arousals which can affect your performance the next day. So with this in mind, let's discuss why are we talking sleep today? And if we just go back to the human performance model, we know that there are some important things which will get my sports person ready. And that is mental preparation, hydration, physical conditioning, nutrition, and sleep. Now with sleep, what is it that we know about sleep? So what we know about sleep is that sleep is definitely very, very different between athletes and non-athletes. There is a marked difference because of the physical activity, the type of stress we are in, the athlete is under in, and that is why there is a need that the value of sleep is made to understand in the athlete, not only from his recovery and injury prevention point of view, but also from the athletic performance point of view. Now, overtraining, which we had seen a very nice talk by Dr. Ahuja yesterday when he discussed about the sleep problems which keep on showing as a very common symptom once there is overtraining. And this overtraining leads to sleep disturbances is known. But if there is an individual who is already having a sleep problem, he will start showing symptoms of overtraining even with a normal training schedule. And that is where a problem starts to occur because you find that rest of them are performing well, but there is one individual whose performance has started to dip down. So that's the time you must look at his sleep. You must see if there is something pre-existing problem which might be tipping the balance off. It's known, it's been found that sleep restriction, serving accuracy in tennis was found to be affected. There have been studies where chronic lack of sleep is associated with increased sports injuries in adolescent athletes. And because it's so much known that today's generation is actually suffering from sleep restriction. Now, there's a subtle difference between sleep restriction and insomnia. Sleep restriction is when the individual does not give himself adequate time to sleep, adequate opportunity to sleep. And insomnia is when the individual, though is lying in the bed, though is giving himself opportunity to sleep, is not able to sleep. Now, this was a study which was done by Dingis et al. And without taking much time, I just want to emphasize that this was a study of 7 days in which they actually made the individual on his own talk about, whether he was feeling good to take a test in the morning and made him actually restrict his sleep to 6 hours from P1 to P7. So all of them in the morning said, yes, I'm fine to take a PVT test, the psychomotor vigilance task test. And when they took the test, interesting finding is with each day, the number of lapses started to increase, the sleep latency started to reduce, meaning there was a problem and the alertness was reducing in the person, but the person was underestimating his sleepiness. And that is where the problem starts. When the individual is not reporting to you that there is a problem, but there is a problem. So what do we do about such cases? It's known that in the committee, there is a consensus statement where sleep is given, a lot of adequate sleep in youth athletes is to be implemented. But somehow what happens is that it is often procrastinated by the people. And what happens is that the person often underestimates the role of sleep. Now, this is a normal hypnogram. We'll talk about this, how we can do, what can we do with the people. This is a normal hypnogram where you see this is REM sleep, and these are all the non-REM episodes. And this is some amount of waking up at night, which happens as the person moves, or maybe just gets, just opens his eyes for a little while, or even without opening his eyes, if he starts feeling little, he's aroused and he just topples, turns over and then goes off to sleep again. Now with this normal hypnogram, the sleep requirements that we have seen is that in the sports people, it's a study done by Scott et al., where they found that it is higher than a usual adult or an adolescent. And around 9 to 10 hours has been advocated. But I would not say that this is the number. It is individualized. So the requirement is very, very individualized. Don't think like this, that he has to sleep 10 hours or he has to sleep 9 hours, but he should feel fresh the next day. He should be alert and vigilant to listen to you. Now, this is a reference of Krieger, Roth, and Dement, our Bible. And there are a lot of factors which play an important role in sleep and sports performance. You can see it is influenced by the homeostatic factors, by circadian factors. You have overlapping factors of travel, jet lag, the competition time, and all these factors are going to affect the individual's sleep and hence the performance. So for all of you who have a important task of making sure that all the training that we have given to our people ultimately gets actually gets translated into a good performance, it is an important thing as doctors to tell them, as coaches to tell our sports people, that please look after your sleep. We have published a few papers, and I'll just, they're all there on PubMed, you can see them. And this was a study where we had done on adolescent archers, and we found out that administrative measures are very important. So repeatedly from the administration, if it comes down that you have to give awareness on sleep hygiene, ambient environmental modifications, sports training modifications to make sure adequate time of sleep is given, dietary sleep time implementations, individualized prescriptions to people who are having a problem, and reinforcement again and again by the coaches and the physicians has proven to be better in our study. Then it improved sleep and improved sports person. Now, this is a person who had a problem where he was not able to sleep well. And he said that he is having excessive sleepiness. And he used to sleep 2 hours during the afternoon, often felt very irresistible sleep during the classes from 11 to 1. So I'll not go into the audio entirely, and let's just discuss his case. So when we started his study, he had problems, and we find this is something called as a sleep diary. You can take a picture of this, and this is simple as this that you have to follow, apart from many other things, which I'll give you some resources from where you can actually use it. This is what we have mapped for him. So it is the sleep time, which is 10 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, how many hours time in bed that he gave to himself. Then, this is actually the amount of minutes that he was in the bed. So you can make out that this is 10 hours and 600 minutes in bed. So it is definitely not restriction. He is lying in bed adequately. 7.5 hours, all in the bed. He didn't take much time to sleep. This is the sleep onset latency, SOL. He did not take much time to sleep, but what he took was the total wake duration. Now, what is total wake duration? Is once you have gone off to sleep, how much time do you take, or how many minutes in the night do you feel you are awake without seeing a watch, just subjectively? So this is his total wake duration, where he felt that after going off to sleep, probably 70-80 minutes he was awake. And notice this is the weekend, this is Saturday, so it's 0 here. This study is published, so you can see the details again. And he kept on saying that the quality is not good. Sometimes it used to be very good, very bad also used to keep on featuring. And every day he was taking a daytime nap of 2 hours. And sleep efficiency was much lesser than 85% on most of the days. So this was our interesting point, where we found that there was a difference between weekend and weekdays because of the training. So we analyzed this person and we found out that there is time in bed is nice, sleep onset was fine, sleep breaks were many, wake up time was generally the same except for weekends. There was a lot of rumination and pre-sleep arousal, which we found out while in our sleep interviews. And there was a tendency to extend his sleep to cover up the debt. And most of the days he had excessive sleepiness. So we started him on non-pharmacological treatments. You can see this study, which is all available on the web. And what we found is after intervention was started, you can see that the sleep has become better. This is what I want you to see. The wake after sleep onset, which was the total wake duration, including our this thing, we have, you can see how it has come to 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 minutes, and so on. And it remained. Even the performance, he was an archer, so you can see the performance has increased. This was his night study. This was before, where a lot of time he's awake, tossing, turning. He went off to sleep fast, but a lot of time he's awake. And this is after 1 month of treatment that you can see there is a change. Now, what is the way forward? Way forward is that we first need to make them aware that there is a problem if you are not sleeping well. And early identification can only happen once they are aware. So a lot of awareness campaigns. Treatment, if there is a problem, immediately, so that once they are optimizing for their best performance, it doesn't become a hindrance. Then identification of sleep reactive people. Now, what are sleep reactive people? Sleep reactive people are those which under stress have a problem sleeping. So there's a study, which is, it's a known literature, that each one of us responds to stress very differently. And there is a certain percentage which responds by affecting their sleep whenever there is stress. So identify them, because whenever they're going for a competition, there is stress, as has been brought out by the psychologists so well. So identify them, they require more help, they need to develop their own basic strategies of self-help. We have to map them, that what works best for each. And this is where our trial is going on. We have a full-fledged recognized trial where we want to actually give them individualized prescriptions. And once this prescription is there with them, they feel very happy, they feel motivated, they are assured that nothing will go wrong on the day of my competition. And the best thing is that when you're training them, you're training adaptations, you can cater to them. You can also think that, okay, if I want the best out of them, how should I plan it? And that is where your microcycles, mesocycles, all can be planned for them in a little special way, so that they are better and individualized prescription can be given so that they're sleeping better despite intense or a normal day. Now, pick up early is a very, very important thing, because I have seen myself, there are so many cases of insomnias which are undiagnosed. There's so many cases of, sleep restriction is so common, circadian rhythm disorder is so common. I saw one a case of restless leg syndrome sometime somewhere. So these are cases which are hidden in our Indian population. They don't even come to us and report to us because they feel it's quite okay. So awareness campaign is very important. Individual susceptibility, one recipe doesn't fit all. Continuous monitoring, and watch out for sleep restriction, because that is your biggest enemy. Society needs, training needs, adolescence, eye time. Eye time is my favorite. All that iMac, eye devices, and fatigue. So these are your watch out things whenever you want to keep an eye on their sleep. And these are some of the resources which I would like to share. Recently, a book of mine has got published, and it is available on Amazon, which actually takes you through how to write a diary, and anybody can use it. It's meant for people, normal people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Datta, for a very nice lecture on a important aspect, sleep. Dr. Tyagarajan, can we take some questions now?
Yes, sir. Thank you. First, Dr. Karuna, could you please stop sharing your screen so that I will project the questions. The first set of questions to Dr. Jolly Roy. In fact, there are a lot of questions again, so we are just filtering it out. And ma'am, Bhaskaran sir, our former Olympian Indian hockey captain, sir wants to know how athletes manage to redraw their routine. In what way they can use psychology tools, because sometimes our athletes are very emotional, family oriented, etc.
Thanks for the question. We do work on the performance routines, and I couldn't fit into this, but if to redraw the performance routine, first we identify what are the ones which really worked for them in previous, and what are the ones which did not work. So which did not work, we move out of it, and we try to make it as simple as possible so that they can reform or change according to the requirement. So that is how we work on the performance routines.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. The next question is the last question is by Dr. Grace. The female athletes getting coaching from a male coach is a bit difficult, and especially when there are symptoms like depression, others due to menstruation where she cannot freely communicate. So there are some barriers. So will it affect their performance, and what is your advice?
I think modern day sports athletes, they don't have that much of an inhibitions compared to the previous 30 years back or something. So these are physiological things that happen. So if the team has got a psychologist there, I think they should be able to go and speak to them. If not, they can also talk to, there are other senior female athletes and get to the coach. I don't think there should be a barrier that they can't speak to a coach on this, because a coach knows everything. So I don't think there should be a psychological barrier. And if there is one, probably the coach himself or even a psychologist can actually train them to tell them that these are things to be discussed in a very professional way. And I don't think there should be any inhibitions on that.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question is from AFMC, Dr. Amar Singh. He wants to know, how do we communicate to an athlete the importance of psychology and how it can help them without them thinking that it's a psychiatric or mental issue?
Previously, about 25 to 30 years back, they used to think there used to be a stigma. But of late, even if they have an inhibition in the beginning, what I see is most of them, they are very forthcoming. So when they come and they understand that it is more of performance enhancement, and we are trying to look at it from one level to the other level, and not trying to stand them with, you have an issue, then it becomes easier. That's why in my lecture, I mentioned we work now more on the strength rather than controlling the negatives. So that's how the change in the paradigm has taken place.
Okay, ma'am. We'll take the question, probably the last question, from Mr. Jack Neo. When dealing with elite sports, in a sports psychological first or performance scientist first, what is the role of the psychologist?
Sports is a sports psychologist first or a performance scientist first? I would say a scientist psychologist, because a psychologist cannot just be talking. I have in my lecture shown the scientific evidence. So without the monitoring, just talking to them will not work. So it has to be a scientist practitioner paradigm that we or approach that we take.
Thank you, ma'am. And probably due to short of time, we'll get the other questions answered by you later. And now the questions to Dr. Karuna Datta. Ma'am, are you available? You have to switch on your audio.
I'm there. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I'll project the questions now.
Yeah.
So first is again from Dr. Grace of Tamil Nadu Sports University about sleep deprivation leading to depletion of glucose in the muscles. And will it relate to this performance?
Yes, I think that's a very, very good question. And actually, sleep deprivation rather not only affects the glucose, but it affects the insulin sensitivity. So you have the entire metabolism going haywire. And as we heard in Dr. Ahuja's talk yesterday, that we want to be optimizing the entire metabolic environment to perform for optimizing the performance. Sleep deprivation will be a very big problem from the metabolic point of view also. And needless to say that people, elderly sports people show even worse scenarios. And it is something which, depending on the amount of sleep deprivation which has happened, it can show very, very deleterious effects.
Dr. Tyagarajan, can you ask the next question?
Sorry, my audio got cut, sir. The next question is from Jack Neo again. Your opinion about polyphasic sleep strategies, ma'am, so how we can maximize the training blocks?
Now, polyphasic sleep strategies may be of great importance if you know when exactly is your event. Now, most of the times what happens is that if your event gets delayed, or if it is not during the time when you were anticipating it, you might end up in a time of the day when actually you are biologically tuned to have a dip in the performance because of the sleepiness. So yes, a pre-event nap, or depending on the individual's how the individual has been performing regularly, you can plan that. But you should be very careful, and you should know exactly when the event is, and you should not be suddenly faced with a scenario where you have planned the best, but the best doesn't happen at the right time. But definitely you should not be telling your person, if in fact, I saw another question where somebody said that if I can catch up in the afternoon 3 hours, that's not a good idea, because the entire metabolism, if you see from the exercise point of view and the hormonal, the entire physiology of the body is aligned in a way that it gives you a good performance the next day. The only circadian dip which happens is generally in the afternoon, especially in a person who has slept well at night, is sleeping well at night, and is normally following his procedure. So at that time, a 20 minutes power nap is a good idea. A relaxation exercise is a good idea, but not a 3 hours nap, because if your event is at that time, you can't now say that, okay, now this is my relaxation, my time of that 3 hours. So it's a very, very tricky situation, because you want the attention to be best at the time of his performance.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question, then we'll go to the fourth question. It is about sleep time of 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. or other time of the clock to avoid dehydration, metabolism of work effectively, by Anita.
I think, Anita, that's a very nice question. That's the best that somebody can ask for, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And that would be the best synchronized with your physiology. But most of the people, I think, if you want to achieve this, what you have to make sure is that there is no excessive exercise or strenuous exercise 3 to 4 hours before sleep time. Food should not be immediately before sleep time, and the person should not be on blue light emitting devices just before sleep. And when he sleeps off, he should be at the right time sleeping off the best. So if you remember the hypnogram which I showed you, he shouldn't be wasting his time trying to sleep. He should sleep within minutes and depth should be achieved the best. So I think if that is possible, that would be the best day for you.
Thank you, ma'am. And one last question, probably for want of time, from Prabhu Physio. We have the habit of snoozing the alarm, and some people do that many times. Will it disturb the sleep of the athlete and change the performance?
So is it that you are snoozing the alarm or the athlete is snoozing the alarm?
The athlete is snoozing the alarm.
So if the athlete is snoozing the alarm, I would like to first see why the athlete is snoozing the alarm. Is it that the sleep is deprived? And is it that there is some problem? Now there is something, called as quantity and quality. The quality may be bad. The quantity may be good. So sometimes we have a feeling that, oh, he's sleeping 8 hours. It should not be lack of sleep. But you realize that he's been tossing, turning. He's been not sleeping well. So quality was bad. And that's why his need is more. So anytime we find a sports person who, after adequate opportunity to sleep, is complaining that he wants to sleep more, there is an issue. We must look into the history.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That concludes our session. So I'll share the program for tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you all for a very interactive, informative session. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Datta and Dr. Roy for sharing the valuable time. And see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thank you.